My wife's name is Emma. Y'all hear a lot of Emma stories over the course of the semester. Her favorite book of the Old Testament, it's true, yeah, is Leviticus. Now, she's kind of strange. She has to be strange to be married to me for a long time anyhow. But one of the reasons she likes Leviticus, and I don't know if we'll get to it today, but we're going to get there, is a lot of people read it and go, okay, boring stuff. Grab the goat by the nose, hold its left ear, and it's all these weird details. But she loves Leviticus because it's an explanation of the sacrificial system. And she believes, and I agree, that you can't understand the sacrifice of Jesus until you understand the Old Testament background of that sacrifice. And there's lots of these weird details in the wave offerings and the grain offerings, but if you get the big picture of Leviticus, it really does set things up perfectly for the New Testament. So as we go through some of these books, Exodus is kind of a fun book. It's got all that stuff about the tabernacle and things. But as we go through some of the books, like Deuteronomy in Leviticus, it's easy to get bogged down in the trees. And I think we have to remember that the trees are important. Certainly the trees were very, very important to the original hearers, or readers, or whatever. But when we encounter that, we have to say, okay, what's the message for us today? We don't have to go through the sacrificial system today. So it's not like we have to pay a lot, but we ought to pay attention to the principles behind it. The principles of holiness, the principles of why we need to sacrifice, the principles of why the sacrifice is sufficient. So as we go through some of these more detailed Old Testament books, don't read the trees, but don't get hung up in the trees, because for us today, I don't think that's necessarily the point. Exodus is, like I said, it's a narrative. Things happen. It's kind of interesting, so we don't have too much of that problem. So, excuse me. Any questions about the text or the textbook as we get started? Okay. The book of Exodus. How did we get here? Okay. One of the other things I think last week, it says, Moses, tell us a story. Moses is still telling the story of how we got to where we are. And Exodus is very much part of that. Exodus is the journey. So it's the journey to Mount Sinai from Egypt. It's the journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. We'll learn that in a map quiz. But that's where they get ready to enter the Promised Land. And they decide not to trust God, except for Joshua and Caleb. And then they have to wander in the wilderness till that whole generation dies. And then they get another chance to do it again. But I want to make sure we understand one of the principles there. We're going to be talking about that wandering generation and Numbers and stuff like that. But were they still God's people? Yeah. So even though they didn't get into the Promised Land, they didn't get God's full blessing, they are still God's people. Did He feed them every day? Yeah. Their shoes didn't wear out. So I think there's a message there for us that we can be saved but still miss out on God's full blessing. If we're just saved and we spend the rest of our life just goofing around, we're missing out on God's full blessing. So I think there's some New Testament connotations there too. All right, Exodus, the journey. Summary ideas. We'll see this, I don't know, I ought to count one of these days and figure it out. A bunch of times, so that you will know that I am the Lord, so that I am God, so that they will know that I am Lord and I am God. So one of the reasons Moses is telling this story is so the Hebrew people can remember this. But initially, as they were experiencing it, they really did need to know who God was. Because even if they knew who God was, they were probably pretty fuzzy on exactly who He was and what He did and how He was different from Osiris or, the crocodile god or something like that. Because they didn't know. They'd been in Egypt for 400 years. They'd kind of lost their culture. So the Egyptians need to know who God is. The Hebrews need to know who God is and how to live with God. They've got to understand that Yahweh God is not the same as Osiris. That Yahweh God is even if you believe in Osiris, okay, you're wrong, but you believe in Him, God is superior to Osiris. Okay? God is not the God of location. God is not the God of function. God is not the God of time. God is the God of everything. So God is God in Egypt. God is God in Ur. God is God everywhere. Okay? If you're Jonah and you try to go to Tarshish because that's as far west as you can get from Israel, doesn't make any difference. God is God in Tarshish too. God is holy. And there are a lot of implications associated with that. Now, Osiris is holy. Well, but that's okay. You can see Osiris. But God is holy. God is different. God is absolute. You can worship Osiris and try to make Osiris do what you want Osiris to do. Did I say that right? Okay. You can worship the crocodile god. You can sacrifice a pig to the crocodile god, and then you go swimming in the Nile and the crocodiles won't eat you. Okay? So you can influence God. You can make God do what you want, because God is kind of, Osiris or the crocodile god. Sometimes he'll eat you, sometimes he won't. There are no absolutes with the crocodile god. But God is holy. God is set apart. God is separate. God is unchangeable. So God is the same. You can't make God do things by sacrificing to Him. Now, God in His mercy will accept a sacrifice as an offering, but you're not making God do something. So it's very different how you relate to God than how you relate to the crocodile god. If you're going to be gods, you've got to be pure. Right? If you're going to worship the crocodile god, then you can go worship the dog god and the cat god and the sun god and everything. No problem. If you're going to worship God, if you belong to God, then you're going to be different from everybody else. And that's really what the laws are designed to help do, I think, too. So the purity of God's community. I am a holy God. If you are my people, you have to be holy too. Right? That's what he says. We're going to look at the calendar. How do you know when to do what you're supposed to do? God will give them a calendar. So how do you live? If I'm a slave, how do I live? Whatever I'm not caught at, right? If I'm one of God's people, how am I going to live? He has to tell them. So when the Hebrews leave Egypt, what do they know? They got, brick making. They got dinner and a lot of jewels. And they know how to make bricks. And I guess they take their goats and stuff with them. What do they know? They don't know how to live. If they know anything, they know Egyptian ways. Okay? So it's all of these things they've got to learn how to do. They know how to live as slaves. They don't know how to live as God's community. We're going to see again the covenant renewed over and over again with different generations. The tabernacle. Tabernacle is the literal presence of God. So think, before Mount Sinai, how did the Hebrews encounter God?
The physical structure.
Yeah. So how does Moses encounter God? Burning bush. But now when Moses goes back to Egypt, do the people encounter God or they encounter Moses?
Moses.
They see the miracles, they see the plagues. They don't really see God, do they? Okay. When they start seeing God, it's a pillar of fire and stuff like that. And then God says, build me a tabernacle so I can be with you. The whole point of the tabernacle is so a holy God can be with marginally holy people. I don't know if you ever thought about that or not. God is in the middle of the camp, right? That's where they arrange themselves around the tabernacle. Why do they build those screens and curtains around the tabernacle? To separate the holy from the unholy. Right? So who can approach the tabernacle? Moses and Aaron and I guess his sons, right? And they have to purify themselves. So it's the presence of a holy God in the midst of His people. And even at that point, the understanding is the people aren't going to remain holy, and that's why you have the curtains. That's why only certain people can come in certain times, certain ways, stuff like that. But the tabernacle is to separate God's holiness from the unholy people, but it's so God can be in their midst. Okay? And then wherever they go, that's where God is. So when they go across the Jordan, eventually the tabernacle is the first thing to go across. When they go into battle, what's in the forefront? Tabernacle. Because that's God's presence leading them into the into the battle. Now, they get kind of confused about that, just like humans always do, and they start treating the tabernacle like a magic talisman, like a good luck piece. Okay, if I've got my good luck quarter, I show that to the Egyptians, and they're going to run away. And they try to win a battle by using the tabernacle. God hadn't told them to start the battle. They just say, okay, we're going to battle the Philistines, and we're going to send our secret weapon out, the tabernacle, and it's going to knock them all dead, just like in Indiana Jones and the movie, right? But it doesn't happen that way. God says, you can't manipulate me. And they actually lose the tabernacle. They lose the presence of God. So when you hear the word tabernacle, think literal presence of God. So God is right around that corner. As Christians, we have a little bit of trouble with that. But if your parents were right around that corner, would you act differently than if your parents weren't right around that corner? Maybe, maybe not. If President Obama was right around the corner, would you act differently than President Obama wasn't right around? If President Collins is right around that corner, am I going to act differently than if he's not right around that corner? No, because he knows exactly who I am. But think about it. If God is right around that, God is standing there. Are the expectations for your behavior different? Yeah. So they have literally God's presence in their midst. That's why the tabernacle is important. How do you honor the covenant? And we're going to get some of the basic festivals or feast or ceremonies. Passover, tabernacles, we're going to see the background of that in Exodus. Okay. Exodus is, I call it the redemptive event in the Old Testament. Now by that I really mean the Exodus from Egypt. This is not the wandering in the desert. Okay. When they go to Egypt, anybody remember how many people go to Egypt? When Joseph says, okay, all y'all come down here. Yes, less than 100, I don't know. How many people leave Egypt?
This one says over 2.
A whole bunch. Somewhere between 600,000 and 2 million. Okay? And most of the variation is due because we're not exactly sure how to translate Hebrew numbers. So do the numbers in the translations mean people or tribes or groups or something like that? Okay? Again, don't misunderstand this. I'm not limiting God's power at all. God wants it, it'll happen, I believe that. 2 million people is a mess of people. Okay? 2 million people might be bigger than the entire population of Palestine at that time. I mean, if you get a group of 200 million people coming at you and you're Edom and you got 1,000 soldiers, are you even you're just going to say, how fast can I run to outrun these 2 million people? So on one level, God wants it. That's what happened. There are 2 million of them. On another level, that's just a mess of people. And I think maybe the 600,000 might be more realistic. Still a whole lot of people. But to me, that's a more realistic number. But so they really, really grow. God has delivered them. And as they leave Egypt, they get the covenant, the law. It's where the covenant is renewed with all of them. And it's a voluntary covenant. They don't have to follow it. They don't have to agree to it. Okay? Deliverance from Egypt. So this is just an overview. Making the covenant. So they go to Mount Sinai. God says, okay, you want to be my people? You don't have to. You want to? Okay, here's the deal. This is what you have to do. If you do this, I'll do this stuff. Fair enough? And people go, okay. And how long does it take them to break the covenant? However long it takes Moses to go up in the mountains, right? So they come back, party is broken out, the golden calf has jumped out of the fire, all kinds of weird sex is going over on the corner. I mean, it's just, you read the text, that's what it says. Now, we just, okay, videos, okay. Hebrew is a very visceral language, okay? And they don't normally pull a lot of punches in Hebrew. Hopefully y'all are all over 15 or something like that. There is sex in the Bible. I'm sorry, but there is. Well, I'm not sorry, but and it's not there necessarily for us to say, okay, that's what we should do. Very often it's there as a bad example. Okay? And what happens on Mount Sinai is worse than it really comes across in the English translation. I mean, it is debauchery, it is perversion, it's not good stuff when Moses comes down from the mountain. Okay? Learn Hebrew and it's all there. So I don't say that to shock you, but I want you to understand the magnitude of how badly they break the covenant. Okay? This is not like they just had a little barbecue or something like that. This is full-blown whatever your mind can imagine. Now the good news is the covenant is not dependent on their behavior. Okay? So can mankind break God's covenant? We can disobey it. Can we destroy it? No, that's the good news. Now, there are consequences to breaking God's covenant, but God's covenant is founded on His promise, not our promise. That hesed we were talking about, God's covenant love. God will continue the covenant. God will provide even if we don't follow the covenant. Now, there are consequences, but God will still provide always. So they break the covenant, they renew the covenant, they get these great detailed instructions for the tabernacle. Okay, take some acacia wood, make sure it's 18.5 feet long, 3.5 inches wide, tapered like this, and it goes, so it just all these incredibly, now on the other hand, if you're going to build a house for God, how close do you want to make sure that it meets God's specifications? Pretty close. And the book also says that God gives His Holy Spirit to inspire the people to make this stuff. Okay. So and this is also God can be in their midst. And I think on one level, as human beings, if something happens very easy for us, how much do we appreciate it? Not much. But if they had to work and take their jewelry and exacting specifications to make this tabernacle and the tent and all that stuff, they would tend to take it a lot more seriously. And they tend to understand the seriousness of it better. Okay, let's see. Talked about all this. Went in as 70, came out as over 600. So they go to Europe. They go to Egypt. Yeah, the south of France. It's really nice. That's the secret gospel of Peter. They go to Egypt. They lose track of who they are. The Egyptians lose track of who they are. And after a point, all the Egyptians know is that there are this mass of people on the northern boundaries who are not Egyptians. Okay, now, I think the textbook talked about the Hyksos, who are kind of foreign invaders that take over Egypt for a while. It may have been those people that lost track. And all they know is they've got 600,000, 1 million people on the northern borders who are very useful, but could be very dangerous. So they said, okay, we cannot let these people be free. We've got to turn them into slaves and control them. So I think that's the turning point. And these people become Egyptian slaves. And they're controlled by Egyptians, they're raised by Egyptians, and I think on some level they lose track of who they are. But now God has a plan, and He uses Moses. All right? Why did God pick Moses? I don't know, just because. If you read the story of Moses' birth, it's a great story, but it's missing almost all the details we would want. Okay, there's an awful lot that's not there. But that's not the point. The point is God is going to provide. Okay, He's going to provide Moses. He's going to provide judges. He's going to provide prophets. God will always provide. Man will try to screw it up, but God will always provide. So we don't know a lot of the names in the story of Moses. Okay, we don't know the name of the Pharaoh. Wouldn't you think that was important? We just don't know it. Okay, so how was Moses raised? His birth gets sneaked in, right? And then what does his mother do?
Puts him in the basket in the river.
Yeah, she knows he's going to be killed. He's going to be discovered. So she just puts him in the basket and lets him float down the river. Is that what happens? No, she's smart. She puts him in the basket close to where Pharaoh's daughter, who doesn't have any children, comes to bathe. Then what does she do? She sends somebody to watch. I'm sorry?
She tells Miriam to watch.
Watch. Okay, so this is not just, okay, I'm going to throw my baby in the garbage, and she's thinking already. So the Pharaoh's daughter finds it. Who does Pharaoh's daughter ask to raise the child? His mama. Right? So God has provided. So Moses is raised as an Egyptian. Isn't he? He's raised as Pharaoh's daughter's son or whatever, right? So he has all the benefits of that kind of Egyptian culture and raising. But he's also raised by his mother. So he has all that Hebrew background too. Okay? Almost sounds like Paul. Paul is, Roman culture, Hebrew culture. Moses is apparently a little headstrong. Right? He sees an Egyptian abusing one of his fellow Hebrews, and what does he do? Kills him. Okay, then he's got to leave town. Again, this is probably the wrong parallel, but Paul kills people too, doesn't he? Sometimes we think, okay, we're Christians, we're all this, but the guys in prison really helped me see this. Is if you think about a lot of the big people in our religion, they're murderers. Moses was a murderer, wasn't he? A convicted murderer. He murdered this guy for no reason other than he's mad at him. That's not good. But God can use people like that. Paul is a murderer, but God can use people like that. So sometimes I think we might might get too proud of our Christianity. It's not us, it's God and what God can do with us. So Moses has got to leave town. He's 40 years old, maybe we think. He spends 40 years as a goat herder. Now, is this good practice for Moses? Yeah. He needs to know how to be a goat herder. He needs to calm down a little bit. Okay? He needs a good wife. He needs the influence of a good father-in-law, Jethro or whatever. Okay? So sometimes I think we forget, but I think Moses is about 80 when he sees the burning bush. Okay? Not a young guy when he sees that. Okay? We don't know for sure, but somehow Jethro is a guy who knows God. He may have been a priest of God like Melchizedek, but it's not absolutely clear. He certainly was a wise man who knew God. Okay, and he helps Moses mature in Midian. So, how long is it going to take God to prepare? Here comes the sermon. How long is it going to take God to prepare you for whatever He wants you to do? 80 years maybe? I don't know. How long did it take God to prepare Moses before Moses was ready for an encounter with God? And the Hebrews were ready to accept Moses, to be ready. It took 80 years. All right. So sometimes patience is required. So, burning bush, take off the shoes, holy place, stuff like that. Moses encounters God. Yahweh introduces Himself. We've talked about this. What does Yahweh mean? Haven't we? I am. Right. And literally in Hebrew it goes, Yahweh, Yahweh. I am that I am. I am who that I am. It says His name twice. Okay, and this is the formal introduction. Again, in Hebrew, it's one of those past tense, present tense, future tense verbs that can be either. So it's the eternity of God. All right, so he's seen the burning bush, he's met God, and God says, Moses, this is what I want you to do. And Moses, as all giants of faith does, says, yes, sir, Lord, I'll get on that right away. Is that what he says? No. What does he do?
Speaking problem I have.
Yeah, as he comes up with just about every, I got the arthritis or something, just anything he can think of. And now remember, this guy's been a goat herder for 40 years. He's probably not used to large crowds of people and stuff like that. So I can understand from his humanness. Okay, and all he's seen is a burning bush. But the answer to all of those objections is God saying, I am. I am with you. I am Yahweh. I will be here. So it's not, even from the very beginning here, it's not Moses' ability, it's God's ability. It's not that Moses is so great, it's the presence of God with him that makes all the difference. Moses is the spokesman. I don't want to say figurehead, but the spokesman, the prophet. That's what a prophet does, is speaks God's message. Okay, so Moses gives a bunch of excuses. God says, "I don't care. I'm going to be with you. I don't care. I'm going to be with you. I don't care." Finally, God gets tired and says, "Stick out your hand." And then they go through that. So he finally gets Moses' attention, and then he goes back. And God says, "Moses, I will be with you." And Moses finally accepts that and goes back to Egypt. Now, does that mean Moses is going to have an easy journey? No. Just because God's with you doesn't mean everything is going to be all peaches and cream and sweetness and light. Okay? Let's see. We'll talk about this. All right. So they go back to Egypt. Moses goes to... Have y'all seen the Ten Commandments? The movie? Y'all have, people don't watch that anymore.
I haven't seen the whole thing. I've seen
Parts of it. You need to watch. It's a real old movie, but it's a really... I don't know.
I've seen some of it.
Yeah.
I've seen a little bit of it.
I think it's a
I've
good
seen
movie.
Joseph the cartoon, exactly.
No,
Prince of Egypt.
no.
Exactly.
You got to watch. I think it's Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments or whatever,
Yeah, I've seen parts of it.
with Charlton Heston as
Yeah.
Moses. Or yeah, it's got some of the worst casting I've ever seen in any movie. Because Edward G. Robinson was a famous, played a lot of gangsters in movies back in the 30s and 40s. And he has just this incredible kind of New York gangster accent. And he is Pharaoh's overseer. And he keeps, it's I don't know, it's fun a lot of it. Watch it, you'll see. It's like, yeah, where's your God now, Moses? Yeah. It's just, watch it and see. It's probably, look up Edward G. Robinson in the Ten Commandments. It'll be, I ought to do that, a clip on YouTube. Yeah, Moses, where's your God now? Yeah. The plagues happen because the Pharaoh won't let the people go. Now, again, if you do, this doesn't necessarily come across in the English, but it's more clear in the Hebrew. In the beginning, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. Okay? After a certain point, God hardens his heart. So I think in my opinion, at the beginning of the process, Pharaoh could have said, okay, I recognize God, I change my life, I accept God as my God, I'm going to let God's people go, and then the story would have been entirely different. Okay? But Pharaoh, in the beginning, says, I don't recognize God, I don't care about God, I'm not going to let my slaves go. Now, at some point, he does come across, he changes to where he says, okay, yeah, you're right, I know who God is, but I'm still not going to change my mind. And at some point, God does harden his heart. And I think there's probably a message there for us today, too. But initially, my opinion is in the Hebrew, Pharaoh is just stubborn. Pharaoh hardens his own heart. Okay? And he goes through the plagues, and they get worse and worse and worse. And then eventually, it's too late. There is no escape for Pharaoh and his oldest son. So how many plagues do they have? 10. Right. Why 10? I don't know, just 10 of them. A lot of people will say, and I think there's some value in this, it may be overdone, but a lot of people will say that each one of the plagues is associated with a specific Egyptian god. Now, in general, I think that's a good comment, because the whole point of this is so that you will know that I am God. So it's kind of like a set of encounters between an Egyptian god and God. So the Nile is a god, okay? And God makes the Nile turn to blood. So it's the competition, who has the most power. Okay, and for the first miracle or two, or first plague or two, the Egyptian gods can kind of hold their own, but by the end of the first quarter, it's God 3 and them 0. So it very, very clear. And then the last plague is the angel of death, the life itself, which is definitely an Egyptian god. So I think this is a battle between what the Egyptians think is holy and God. It's kind of like, not Jeremiah. Who's the prophet Elijah with Baal and the fire? Yeah, it's kind of like that. Take all yours and put them on one side and see if you can start the fire. So this is an indication to the Hebrews who God is, and to the Egyptians who God is. So eventually they leave. And this is where we get the Passover. So what's the very last plague is the angel of death is coming, right? Notice that sometimes the plagues use natural events. Hail, frogs, things like that. But it's an unnatural timing. Okay, so the hail comes at the wrong time. Or the hail, is it unusual in September to find afternoon thunderstorms? No. Would it be unusual if I say, okay, on September 14th, there is going to be a tornado that goes down Highway 64, starting at 3:15 and it'll be gone by 3:17? Would that be unusual if I predicted that right now? Yeah. Okay. So sometimes the timing is not the event so much, tornado, sometimes the miracle is not so much the event, it's the timing. And that it starts when Moses says, it stops when Moses says, obviously under God's control. All right. And then the Hebrews are immune from the plagues too. So it comes down to Passover. Why do we call it Passover? The angel of death is coming. God warns the Hebrews through Moses to do what?
To kill a sheep and put the blood on the door.
Right. Take the lamb or a goat or something and put the blood over the door. And then what happens if the blood's over the door?
The angel passes over.
Passes over. Okay. That's where we get the name Passover. It's literally the angel of death passing over. Now, again, if you read the text very carefully, is there any restriction as to whom the angel of death will pass over? I don't know if I said that right or not. How is the angel of death told to pass over the house?
The blood.
Blood on the doorpost. If the Egyptians hear God's word and follow God's word, what happens to the angel of death when they get to the Egyptian house with the lamb's blood over the doorpost? You would assume the same thing. There is no distinction in the text. It's whether you obey God's word. It's not genetic, whether you're Egyptian or Jewish. It's whether you obey God's word. And when we actually look, again, if you read the text very carefully, when they leave Egypt, Egyptians go with them. So I think even then we're seeing that openness of God to respond to anybody who obeys Him. So it's the final plague, angel of death. Pharaoh kicks them out and sends them away, loads them up with jewels and all kinds of other stuff, and says, okay, just get out of here. I don't want any more of that. Now, Pharaoh hasn't become a Hebrew. Pharaoh hasn't become a God believer or a God obeyer, but at least he understands that God is more powerful than all the other Egyptian gods. So this is the creation of the Hebrew nation. Okay? These are God's people now as they leave Egypt. And that's a huge deal. This is one of the ceremonies that they have to celebrate forever. As soon as they enter Israel, every year, that calendar thing, they have to celebrate Passover. And we see them doing it even until today. And of course, the new covenant under Jesus is the new Passover that we celebrate as the Lord's Supper. So they start leaving Egypt. We can argue about, do they take the northern route, the southern route, the middle route? But they get to the Red Sea. Again, we can argue about where the Red Sea is, but it's this big body of water that you can't cross. And the Egyptians are chasing them. God puts the pillar of fire behind them. All right? I never can remember. I've got a half hour left. Okay. How does God part the Red Sea?
On the priest's first steps.
No, that's close. That's Jordan, I think. How does He part the Red Sea? Okay, Moses holds out his staff, right? But then what happens?
Doesn't he put it in the water?
Feel like the wind pushes it against
Yes.
and stops it. And
Yes. Why can't I find that right now? It says, the wind blows overnight and backs the water up in the east. Is that what it says? can't believe I can't find it.
Exodus 14.
Yeah, like I said. Where is that? Which verse? I'm sorry.
20.
Yeah, thank you. Read that for me, please. Oh, yes, God uses wind to part the sea. I even have a note on this side. Exodus 14:21. Someone read that for me, please.
And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided.
Okay, so it doesn't necessarily make so much difference where it was. It's the point that God parted the sea. And God could use all kinds of means, but as we go through the Old Testament, we'll see very often He uses natural means. Okay, and here He used an absolutely natural mean, wind, to blow all night, and it backed the water up like walls, is what it says.
It took all night for the water to separate, or the water separated quite quickly, but the wind kept blowing all night to keep it separate?
I don't know. You can't really tell. But the point is, God could have just spoken in the water, but God used natural means. So God uses a wind to bring the doves when they get tired of manna and stuff like that. So just because it's natural events doesn't mean it's not under supernatural control. Okay, it happens exactly when God wants, starts when God wants, stops when God wants, is the point I want to make here. But it's God is using natural means. God is just like God uses Moses. Something natural and human and physical to accomplish His purpose. Okay? And then everybody knows the story that the water rushes back in and kills all the Egyptians. Now, two things going on there. The Hebrews are delivered from the Egyptians, right? But they're also cut off from going back. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. They can't get back across the Red Sea either. So they've got to go forward. And of course, what do they start doing as soon as they start going towards Mount Sinai? Oh, Moses, it's hot here. You know, we could have died in Egypt. Yeah, at least they'd give me a grave. So I think in God's wisdom, you know, God kind of multitasks, accomplishes a lot of things all at the same time. He understood that they needed that door closed. Because I think if it hadn't been, a lot of them would have just, oh, go ahead, Moses, I'll catch up with you later. And they would have gone back to Egypt, even though it was slavery, because it was something they were comfortable with. Okay, and there's a sermon there today, too, for us. But anyhow, they go to Mount Sinai. I think it takes them about 3 months to get there. We don't know for sure where Mount Sinai is. Does it really make any difference? No. Again, we had this discussion in the New Testament class. Does it make any difference if the Exodus happened in 1400 BC or 1200 BC? Does it make any difference based on our understanding of the importance of the text or the implications of the text? No. Now, you know, I think it's good to, we can see, we're getting to the point here now where we can see a real good lineup between archaeology, extra-biblical history, and the Bible. We can start comparing a lot of names and kings and dates and saying, yes, they line up perfectly. But we're not quite there yet. Okay? There is no archaeological evidence of the Exodus. Okay? There just isn't any. Now that shouldn't surprise you, because what does it normally take to create archaeological evidence?
A certain place they were at.
For a lot, buildings, right? They have any buildings in the Exodus? No. What'd they do? They wandered. What'd they leave behind? I don't know, trash, shoes, goat skins. What do you reckon the half-life of that is on an archaeological basis? None. We're not going to get any evidence of the Exodus. Now, what we can get archaeological or historical evidence of is Egypt before they leave. And we've got some that indicates a lot of good a lot of good similarities. We can look at the Promised Land at about that time, and we've got a lot of good parallels. But we don't necessarily have exact parallels. If you look at the biblical text, it probably favors an earlier date for the Exodus, 1400. If you look at the archaeology, it probably favors a later date, 1200. Okay? And it just right now we don't have enough good evidence to say the archaeology is absolutely right or wrong. Because you're trying to, we're talking about a 200-year span. Okay? And I'll give you an example of the archaeological evidence. When they invade, when they take over the Promised Land, what do they do to all the people there? What do they do to all the cities? They burn them, destroy them, stuff like that. So you should be able to go to the Promised Land. And if the Exodus happened in 1200 BC, you should find all kinds of burned out cities in 1200 BC, shouldn't you? Okay? And that's what you find. You find a lot of destroyed, rubble, burned cities and stuff like that around 1200 BC. Now, how do you tell it's exactly 1200 BC? I don't know. I mean, carbon dating, coin stuff. So when we think about archaeology, we're thinking about kind of an inexact science too. So they can say, well, yeah, about 1200. Could it have been 1400? Well, maybe could have been 1000. Maybe. They just don't know. Okay. Now, the second problem with archaeology is they said, okay, they go to the city of Ai, right? And they destroy the city of Ai. Now, that says that in the Bible. God says it, I believe it, that settles it, right? Now, if I'm an archaeologist, how do I know where to look for Ai? Ai is somewhere between here and Noonan. Okay? I mean, the Bible gives us sort of a general location, doesn't it? But now, 3,000 years from now, if I come back here and I know where Noonan is and I know where Peachtree City is, how am I going to find Ai?
Somewhere between
So I'm going to use, ground searching radar. Now, I find a settlement, a little group of 100 houses, and it's between Peachtree City and Noonan. If I'm an archaeologist and I've spent 5 years looking for it and millions of dollars, what am I going to call that city? Ai, of course I am. Is it really Ai? Oh no. Now, we're kind of making a joke about they don't even know for sure where biblical Jericho is. They know where modern day Jericho is. They've got lots of ruins all over, but they don't really know for certain. So if they don't really know for certain which town it is, if they can't really say exactly what the date is, I'm not going to get too upset about whether it's 1400 BC or 1200 BC. And as we go through the Kings and Judges, we're going to have all those arguments, and that's kind of the last thing I'm going to say on them, unless y'all just really want to discuss it. Okay? Did it happen? Yes. Am I going to argue about 200 years difference? No. Oh, okay, here's where. All right. They get to Mount Sinai, chapter 19. Now remember, Mount Sinai is where Moses encountered God in the first place, I think. 19:1, in the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. Most likely location for Mount Sinai is the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula. I think the book has a map of it. So it takes them 3 months to get there. Not a terribly long time if you've got 600,000 people walking somewhere. Okay. Somebody read me chapter 19, verses 5 and 6.
Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Okay, so God is remaking the covenant. And he says, okay, you'll be my people. That sounds pretty cool. Okay? And I've even got work for you, kingdom of priests. So from the very beginning, the function of being God's people was to carry God's message to the world. Now, as we'll discuss, it's kind of one of those good news, bad news things. But God is laying out the broad principles of the covenant. Who goes up Mount Sinai? Only Moses. Because everybody else is afraid to encounter God. There's this whole idea of God is so holy, you can't even approach him. Okay? So the covenant, in essence, defines a relationship. You will be my people. And God, in his mercy and his wisdom, talks about that in family terms. Okay? You will be my children.
Just like you are Israel's children, that the grandfather Israel, the patriarch Israel, you will be my children. And this is how you're going to be saved. How are they saved? Read verse 5 again.
Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you'll be my treasured possessions, although the whole earth is mine.
Okay. So you're going to be mine because I say so. Now, think about it. If you want to be saved before Jesus, if you're a pagan Assyrian or something like that, if you're Rahab, if you're Ruth, you want to be saved, what do you have to do to be saved? Become Jewish. If you're Jewish, what do you have to do to be saved?
Follow His word.
You're born saved because you're Jewish. Who did God make the covenant with? Jews. Hebrews. Sons of Israel. You're born into the covenant, aren't you? Now, you get circumcised, you obey the law, all that stuff in response to being a child of God. So you follow the law because that's a way to please God with your life. But you're saved because you're born Jewish. Okay? Very big distinction between Christianity and Judaism. Or between salvation before Jesus and after Jesus. It's always based on faith in God. But after Jesus, it's based on the sacrifice of Jesus. Before, you're just trusting God. The law does not save you. Okay? Anywhere in the covenant does He say the law saves you? It says, okay, here come the 10 commandments. These 10 commandments will save you. No. It says, here's how to live a life pleasing to me. Here are my standards for behavior. If you join the covenant, you're my people. Now that you're in, here's how you stay in, or here's how you please me now that you're in. So you're saved by the covenant. The law is just how you please God. So even from the very beginning, that law was not salvation. Now, they very quickly turned to treat it that way. We talked about God's covenant love. God provides in all so many ways. The way He talks to us, the idea of the covenant, the fact that He stays faithful to the covenant. Even when the people break the covenant, when Moses comes, God is ready to make Moses the next Noah, right? He comes down, debauchery is broken out. God said, let me kill all these people and I'll raise up another group for you, Moses. And Moses intercedes for the people. Right? And it's God's covenant love that eventually says, okay, I'll give these guys another chance. Covenant is not based on us, covenant is based on God. Let's see. Okay, now the covenant has conditions. When God made a covenant with Noah and gave him the rainbow, were there any conditions there? God said, I'll never give another flood again, and as a sign of that, I'm going to show you a rainbow. Any conditions associated with that? No. Are the conditions associated with the Mount Sinai covenant? Yes. Okay? So it's like good news, bad news. Good news, you're going to be my people. I'm going to be your God. I'll provide for you. I'll give you the promised land. All you have to do is cross the river. Fair enough? Okay. Now, if you're going to do that, here's what happens if you don't. So we get this parallels of blessings and curses. If you follow me and stay loyal to me and worship me, you get all the goodies. If you don't, what happens? Something bad. Okay, and it depends. But if you don't follow God, there are consequences. And we'll see that work out in the Judges, where every man does what he thinks is right in his own eyes, right? And that's a quote from Judges. So, if the people agree to this, they must obey God. Whatever God says, that's what they do. God says move, they got to move. God says don't move, they don't move. God's not forcing it on them, but if they want to do it, then they got to do it. All right, each blessing carries a responsibility and a consequence. God calls the people to faith and obedience, and the people promise to serve and follow, and then they immediately start disobeying Him. Let's look at this is the one we focus on, kind of the 10 Commandments And again, depending on how you number them, this is Exodus 20, they're more or less or whatever. And they're not just these commandments. These are just like the summary ones. Okay, the first ones we get. And you know, if you're Catholic, you don't think the commandments start until verse 3. So Exodus 20 verse 3 says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Right? And that's normally the one that Catholics or Protestants would start with. But if you ask a Jew what the first commandment is, they'll go back to that verse 2. "I am the Lord your God." Okay, and if you think about it, we see that more as a statement. They see that as a commandment. They see that they are commanded to honor God as their God. And it goes through, and y'all have probably heard sermons about all this. But if you look at it in general, the first 4 commandments are sort of a vertical relationship. Our relationship with God. Who is God? How do we worship Him? Why is that important? Okay. "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness which is in heaven above. You shall not worship them or serve them. Okay. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." Okay. So it's all about how do you relate to God in a way pleasing to God. And it's essentially about the priority and holiness of God. Now, the last 6 are, okay, given that, how do we relate to everybody else? How do we live, how do we relate to a holy God, and then how do we relate to everybody else on holy principles? Okay? And these are not, I mean, if you think about it, the 10 Commandments are incredibly non-detailed, non-specific maybe. Okay, "You shall not steal." Okay, what does that mean? Don't. Yeah, but what does it exactly mean? You know, is there a corner case, or you know, if the money just happens to get in my pocket and God in His wisdom understands that that's exact. What do you mean? Well, is it an adultery if So a lot of, why do we get Deuteronomy? Why do we get all these detailed things? It's I think God understands that as soon as you tell people not to do something, they're going to start looking for loopholes. Right? So some of all the rest of these laws are explanations. So what is murder? Okay. Is murder accidental? No, murder is not accidental. Is thieving accidental? No. So they go, if you find your neighbor's ox, or you get all these detailed things, and that's not even enough. And we talked about this. So when does the Sabbath start? Right. So that's an important question. If you can't work on the Sabbath, what constitutes work? And again, you get some things in the Bible, but you get once you get into the Pharisees, they wanted to make sure, okay, it says not work, but I want to make sure I really don't work. So, if the bullseye is where I want to avoid, I'm going to draw a circle around the bullseye and never get any closer than the circle. So they started coming up with all kinds of loopholes and qualifications and workarounds that really got very, very ridiculous. Okay? You can't work on the Sabbath, right? It says that in the Bible. Now, what's God's purpose there? What would Jesus say the purpose of the Sabbath is?
So you have a day to be with Him.
Right. It's a day dedicated to God. Okay. But no, what they would say is, no, we can't work. So if the bullseye is work, I'm going to draw a circle around work and make sure I never even get close to working on the Sabbath. Okay, so they're taking the wrong attitude. So I can't start fires on the Sabbath. Okay, I can hire a Gentile to start a fire, but I can't start a fire. Walking is work because it's movement, I guess, or something. So I'm restricted as to how far I can walk on the Sabbath. Well, how far can I walk on the Sabbath? Well, I got to be able to walk around my home, so it's okay to walk around my home. Okay. Is it okay to visit my neighbors on a Sabbath? So what they did was they put planks between the roofs of their houses. Because they said, if I'm not walking on the ground, it's not work.
Calm down.
So why does Jesus say man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man? It's because they're doing all these little splitting hairs and saying as long as my feet don't touch the ground, it's not walk or work, or I can hire a Gentile to do something, but I can't do it. Jesus is saying, you missed it. Okay? Honor the principle. And I, again, to go back to where I started, I think that's why God immediately gives all these details, because He understands people. Well, is it adultery or is this adultery? Is it, if I just, and that's why Jesus has to come back and say, from a New Testament perspective, even if you lust in your heart, it's adultery. Now, the good news is you're forgiven. The bad news is it's a whole lot easier to sin than you think it is. So when we read all of this stuff about if your ox gets loose and gores somebody or whatever, our tendency is to slip over it. But try to see the forest there. Okay, God understands that people are going to sin, and He says, okay, here's a way for resolution, even if you do sin. A lot of those laws don't apply to us anymore. Right? Do the kosher laws, the cleanliness laws, for instance, apply to us anymore? No. That's that whole Peter thing in the New Testament where he sees the blanket coming down with the clean and unclean animals, and God saying, if I've made it clean, then it's clean. Right? But let's look at the big picture here. So there is some religious law. There's all this sacrificial law. Do we have to follow that anymore? Jesus has done away with all of that. There's all of this religious law. Do we have to follow that anymore? No, Jesus has done away with that. There are all these purity and thread laws and stuff like that. Do we have to follow that anymore? No, I don't think so. Is human life still valuable? Yes. It's valuable because it's made in the image of God, and that gives it its value. So that things like that don't change. Based on the surrounding culture, did human life have value? Not if you're poor. If you're the king, you don't care who you kill, do you? If you're the king of Egypt, I'd feed them to the crocodiles. Okay? Very much, even in the first century, you see this gross retaliation. Okay, if somebody poor steals a loaf of bread from you, in Egyptian times, what do? Everybody say, kill them. That's what you do. Now, is that fair? I guess if you're an Egyptian and you're king, it's good, but so there's this idea of gross retaliation. And the death penalty is what most people do if they can get away with it. And again, we see that even in the Roman times. You cross the Roman, what's he going to do to you? Kill you. Okay? Give you an unfair trial, then kill you. Is there a different legal system for the king and for everybody else? Yeah. Because the king makes the law, right? Under God's principle, is David held to the same standard as everybody else in his kingdom? Yeah, that's a huge difference. So when we get down to the ox goring and stuff like that, let's read it and understand it, but get the big picture too. What God is telling these people is incredibly different than what they've heard from anywhere else. God's law is very, very different. Should weaker members of society be protected? Notice how many times it says widows and children should be protected, right? That's not something you're going to see from an Egyptian, okay? It's incredibly different. We talked about this. Talked about the tabernacle, living presence of God. God is with us. And just a quick, I got time for this. Quick New Testament parallel. The Gospel of John. Everybody go there real quick. So the tabernacle is the literal presence of God with His people in the Exodus, right? Go to John 1. And the tabernacle is a tent. Somebody read me John 1:14.
And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory, glorious of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth.
Okay, and I'm sorry, you said dwelt among us?
Yeah.
Does anybody else have a different translation there? What's the New Living? Oh, we don't have the New Living.
Mine says made His dwelling among us.
Yeah, made His dwelling. The actual Greek word there is pitched His tent. is the word for pitched. And it literally means tabernacled. So given that Exodus context of the tabernacle being the presence of God, how would you interpret verse 14? And the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us.
Angels with us.
Yeah. It is the physical presence of God with us in Jesus, just like the tabernacle was the physical presence of God in the Exodus. Okay? That is exactly, and John uses that word to pull in that Old Testament parallel there. Okay, so Jesus is not just living among us, Jesus is not just dwelling among us, Jesus is tabernacling among us. Okay, and again, I can say that with some confidence because if I look at the Greek translation, the Septuagint of the Hebrew Old Testament, they use that Greek word for tent making. So if I read the Greek Old Testament, it says when it talks about the tabernacle, it's that word that John uses there in Greek. So God is with them in the Exodus. God is with us in the person of Jesus. Notice that God never asked them to build a temple. God never asked for a temple. God never asked for a lot of those things that David and Solomon decide they need. God asked for a tabernacle so that wherever the people go, God can be with them. Because the important thing is to be with God. Well, let's look at Exodus 34:10. Maybe we'll end here. Exodus 34:10. Someone read that for me, please.
Then the Lord said, I am making a covenant with you. Before all your people, I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do for you.
Okay, and when they get to Jericho, the people in Jericho are actually afraid of them. They close the city doors when they get close because they have heard what God is going to do. So verse 11, be sure to observe what I'm commanding you this day. Behold, I'm going to drive out the Amorites before you, and the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Watch yourself that you make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land into which you are going, or it will become a snare in your midst. Okay? But rather you are to tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and cut their asherim. For you shall not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is a jealous God. He's protective of His honor. Is it a dangerous thing to worship God? Yes. If you're going to be one of God's people, you have to live as God wants you to. Regardless of whether you want to or not, you've got to be a holy people. So why is God going to drive out the people in the Promised Land? Essentially idolatry. They have refused to accept Him, so He's going to drive them out. What will happen to the Hebrews if they refuse to accept God?
They don't get the promised land.
Well, they get it, but then they get the Promised Land, and then they succumb to idolatry, just like the Jebusites and the termites, and then what happens to them? God drives them out. Okay? So God's standard is the same for everybody. All right, good. So Monday, we'll pick up Leviticus. Any questions? No. All right, thanks guys. Have a great weekend.